Loving Sports When They Don't Love You Back is the fantastic new book by Jessica Luther and Kavitha Davidson. Folks, you're very welcome to the show. Kavitha, I guess it's fair enough to say that this book explains why everybody's relationship with sport should at least be a little bit complicated.
A little bit complicated. I want to preface this by saying that Jessica and I love sports so much. We wouldn't choose to write about this for a living if we didn't, but we see a lot of issues around sports that I think a lot of fans identify with and a lot of fans see as well. And sitting with those issues and those dilemmas while continuing to love the sports is what we were trying to explore in this book.
When did your relationship with sport get a little bit complicated? When did you realize that, hang on, there are some things here that I shouldn't automatically support or I shouldn't automatically love? I actually want to get both of your takes on that. So Kavitha, do you want to start us off on that one?
Yeah, I think, it's always really complicated for me when an athlete is accused of violence against women. I'm a sexual assault survivor myself, so I take that personally. But I think we also manage to use sports and other areas of entertainment and frankly politics as well. Whenever it's famous and rich people that we like who are being accused, we tend to use sports as a way to shield those players from those accusations and to kind of deny the realities of what's going on. So that's an issue that I always that always kind of rings that alarm bell for me. The second one that I think every fan can identify with is taxpayer dollars going to stadiums. Whether or not you're a sports fan, you pay for the stadium. That's just been built there, especially in the US. I'm frankly not quite sure how it works in Ireland, but that's a big deal. And it doesn't usually go to a vote, and it usually takes away from other budgets for your municipalities. And I think that just speaks to our skewed priorities, especially in the US, when most of these teams and leagues can afford to pay for these stadiums on their own.
Right, okay. There's a couple of things there which we'll definitely come back to. Jessica, what about you? What are the things about sport that don't love you back?
Yeah, well, I think lots of girls and women have experienced just feeling like interlopers or outsiders. I can't remember this well enough, but I played middle school basketball, and I'm sure when I was in, how old would I have been? 12 years old, that I understood that there were differences and who was actually an athlete and cared about within middle school. But I'm with Kavitha. I have a lot of trouble with gendered violence within sport, and not that it exists there because it exists everywhere, but how people react to it. I think it's very difficult to watch someone be cheered because they've come back from a suspension for doing harm to someone else, and they get to be cheered because it's sports, and that we have this whole thing around redemption. And so anytime I'm paying attention to women's sports, I mean, you can't be online and say you're a fan of women's sports without people reminding you how much they don't care about it, that they have to tell you how much they don't care about it. So I feel like that's always something you're bumping up against.
It's interesting when you mentioned the first point there about the terrible things that sports people do. You mentioned the word redemption, and it is very interesting that sport in many ways can mirror real life, that whenever we talk about a comeback, whenever we talk about a team coming back from the brink, it is redemption. And we have this handy knack of also using that for individuals, despite the fact that their redemption should never be possible in the first place.
Well, I'll push back on that a little bit. I do think that redemption is possible. I think that second chances can be warranted. I think that our bar for how you earn that second chance is super low. It's just low across the board, and it's even lower for people that we want to be redeemed. One of the last additions to the book was a few paragraphs after Kobe Bryant died that I added about how personally torn I was as someone who grew up loving Kobe Bryant, like from the bottom of my heart. And I was 14 years old when he was accused of rape, and I didn't want to believe any of it. I made all of the same excuses that we all make about how the woman who accused him was a cleat chaser and why was she in the hotel room and all kinds of things like that. And now as an adult and also a sexual assault survivor myself, I understand that those are mechanisms that we use in order to excuse people that we don't believe are capable of doing things like this. The thing with Kobe, though, is he was about to enter this second act that we've been robbed of. Like, we'll never get to see what Kobe, the supporter of women's sports, and what Kobe, hopefully, the redeemed, apologetic, accused person would have looked like. And that's such a conflict for me. So I do think that impetus to defend that person, it comes very much from within. It comes from within our inability to extricate ourselves from our own personal feelings and personal relationships with that person who's been accused.
And I also think, though, that like what you're talking about, Kavitha, with robbed of the second act, like that's a lot of stuff that he was not doing on the basketball court. And I think what I have trouble with the redemption narrative within sport, specifically around gendered violence, but this could be like anyone who's causing harm off of the pitch or off of the field or the court, is that scoring a goal is not redemption for that harm. Like scoring a touchdown is not the thing that's redeeming you for the harm that you've done to someone else. And we conflate those all the time within sports rhetoric. And I think that's a dangerous thing to do because it takes away actual accountability and puts you just being good at sports does not mean that you have somehow been excused from harm that you're doing somewhere else in your life. And we're not good at that. And so, yeah, Kavitha spoke to that perfectly.
I guess as well that there is a natural tolerance for the people who are athletes, I guess, because this is a theme across the entire book of people who have done wrong on various different levels, but who are in different positions within sport. It does seem that, say, people who are running a franchise, people who are at the very top tier of a franchise, as you talk about in chapter 13, I think in the book, rather than those who are actually performing for the team, the players. And it seems that there is a lower tolerance for those at the very top of a franchise than there are for the players. The players are like these demigods. These people are beyond reproach. Is that a fair thing to say?
I don't think so, actually. I think most of the book, except for a couple of chapters and the one about gendered violence being an example, most of the book speaks to systems, and most of those systems start from the top. So, there's a whole chapter about bad team owners, and they're all kinds of reasons.
That's the chapter I'm referring to. Yeah, sorry, chapter 9, actually.
Right. I have no idea which chapter is which, frankly.
Me either. I was like,
which one was 13?
Yeah.
Bad team owners, when it comes to assembling a roster, or like I said, getting taxpayer dollars to pay for their stadiums when they are all billionaires here. Putting out racist mascots and team names and logos, putting out statements that are not supporting their LGBTQ plus fans. Like all of these things kind of start from the top. And a lot of the things that we're talking about actually are trying to get fans to see athletes themselves as humans and as workers, because they are doing a job here, especially in the United States. This is their job. And I think that fans often forget that. They get mad when players leave to other teams because they haven't been loyal. But the reality is those team owners and that team management will never be loyal to that player unless they have something to continue to give. And so it should work both ways. And we're trying to get people to see how these systems work, how the owners at the top are, management. When you're talking about labor versus management, especially in the United States, we have such a fraught history, a fraught labor relationship in the way that we relate to them. But we're trying to get people to see that these are systems that very much reinforce the way that we think about these economic priorities and the way that we think about these athletes as, having to go out on a field to play a game for our entertainment instead of what they are, which is workers who are doing a job.
That's really true. I guess my wrong take there was this idea that you can, as you say, Jessica, score a goal and redeem yourself. It does seem that there's more vociferous, not hate, but certainly distaste towards owners, to use that terrible phrase, of sports teams, that they have less redemptive ability. They can't score as many points in a game or whatever, but obviously that's wide of the mark that they are similarly judged in American sports circles.
Yeah, well, I think you have to be a very good sports star in order for that redemption narrative to work in a specific way. I mean, we saw that, especially here in the U.S. with Ray Rice, which is a very famous case where we all saw the video, sadly, of him hitting his wife, and it just so happened to pair up with the fact that he was declining on the field. So the Baltimore Ravens weren't going to go to bat for him. So it doesn't matter. Like, they do have to be a certain level of useful on the field, and then they're given that opportunity. And I think, we have there's a way that we hate team owners and we like to talk about that, but there, as like Kavitha was saying, within a system, there's no accountability for them. And we do, because of capitalism and the way that it works in our brains, we tend to, and I also think racism is at play here. The fact that a lot of these owners are white and a lot of the stars, especially here in the US that we're talking about, are black and brown. There's a way that fans imagine themselves as ownership rather than the athletes themselves. They want, like in their dreams, they wish they could be those athletes, but it makes a lot more sense for them to imagine themselves as owners. And so there's a lot of forgiveness there and excuse making. And then, of course, systems are always going to protect the people at the top. So even if they do like in the NBA, Donald Sterling, we knew for decades. Kavitha wrote a really, like, she wrote that part of the book and like really lays out like how well we knew that this man was a racist person. And it just took so much because the system was able to coddle him for a really long time. And it's so, I guess what I'm saying is it's nice to have money.
And he ended up making $2 billion from that.
Made a ton of money off of it. Yeah.
Yeah, that point about fans seeing themselves as owners is a really interesting one. And I guess that
we now have fantasy sports, right? Which is like we even have like an entire infrastructure set up to make people feel that way.
It's very true. And I do wonder as well, does that tie in a little bit? Like, I know that you talk about Wilma Rudolph at the 1960 Olympics, and you talk about her homecoming, which was due to be segregated. And I guess at that point, well, it's still a case now, but at that point, it was particularly hammered home that the public of the United States saw athletes as theirs, as, you know, they expect them to perform for them, and they will love them as long as they don't get political or as long as they don't upset them. Does that feed into the same notion of fans seeing themselves as owners somewhat at the point you were just making there, Jessica?
Yeah, that's actually a great point. Yeah, I think absolutely it does. And again, I'll just point back, I think race matters. I think it's much more difficult for a Colin Kaepernick, a black quarterback, to speak out, the WNBA being 80% black and speaking out. I mean, I think that's always going to play a huge role. But also, yeah, I do think the fact that most of the time fans relate to these teams from the top down, like we've all done it, and this is like a really benign version of it. I do it all the time where I will be talking about a team that I love and I'll say we, as if like I have anything to do with it. Like, we are going to win. Like, there is this ownership feeling that's tied into your identity. But I do think it puts us more in the perspective of ownership rather than the athlete themselves, which is why, as Kavitha was mentioning, we felt it was important to remind people constantly that these are human beings, that these are laborers.
Who are constantly fighting for labor rights, for unionization. And especially here this past summer, we saw college athletes try to, push for a union, which is something that, hopefully they'll continue to build that fight on. I think when you look at the way that some fans talk about how athletes get paid, how much they get paid, especially when they sign new contracts, it's always, they're greedy, or they're only in it for the money, or they held out to maximize their salary, which any one of us would do in our jobs. But it's just because there's this notion that because they play a game, that they don't deserve to make as much money as they do, while the owners are these billionaire businessmen that we, just especially here, again, I'll say in this country, we have this notion that people who have made a lot of money have earned it, and people who are workers have done something wrong. There's this idea of meritocracy, and that's a fallacy in a lot of ways. And it also just belies the notion that these athletes, from the time, they are probably 7 or 8 years old, sacrifice and work in order to get to the level that they can make the kind of money that they do. And even when they're in college, more than half of college athletes in basketball and football especially think they're going to make it to the pros, and it's less than 2% that actually does that. So you think about what it takes to actually get to this level. Fans never really, I shouldn't say never, not to paint all fans with a broad brush, but fans often have a hard time accepting just how much they put into this. And I think that a lot of that, frankly, is that we armchair quarterback. We wish we were they, and we're just not.
Yeah, and I would say sports media plays a huge role in that too. I mean, this sort of combative talking head argument style that a lot of sports media, they're doing that work on television and on sports radio that Kavitha's talking about. Like, they do that work for the fan.
Extracting nuance as much as possible, because with nuance, you don't actually get to allow that fandom to play out on television, and therefore the ratings will go. And without nuance, you can't actually have any intelligent debate. I guess every part of this loses when you have this being injected with the oxygen from those sort of shows that you refer to there.
Yeah, I mean, and I always kind of bring this up. Americans are really very black and white about how we look at a lot of things, but especially sports, right? I mean, we cannot handle the idea of a scoreless draw. It's just not a thing that's in our conception, right? So, you know, sports are very black and white in that way. There's a winner or a loser. Whenever someone starts to create an argument, what do they say? They tell you to look at the scoreboard, right? And the fact is, with all of these dilemmas that we're talking about in the book, none of them are really black and white. There's no right or wrong answer. It's not our job to tell a fan how to feel about any of these issues. And by the same token, there's no one solution. And one of the takeaways from this book is that sometimes you just have to sit in the discomfort. You have to sit in that gray area and have that conversation and be okay with the fact that you might not settle on a solution here or there, that there isn't necessarily a good or a bad when it comes to a lot of these things. And that's true in society too.
Definitely. And one of those gray areas that I wanted to get into here is doping. Chapter number 2 is called Forgiving the Doper You Love. One of the questions actually that I'm really keen to get both of your takes on as well is, how much does doping matter to sports fans? Like, do sports fans care in the year 2020 about their major league teams having doping scandals?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. This chapter was so revelatory to me because I went in with that very black and white. I was like, doping is bad, it is cheating. And then I started working on it and I was like, I actually don't know what it is. And I don't know how they figure it out. And it's super arbitrary, and punishment itself, I think that part really gets me. The punishment is really arbitrary. And sometimes fans care so much. So that chapter is built around Lance Armstrong. I'm from Austin, Texas. I lived through that roller coaster of Lance Armstrong. We still have deep feelings in the city about him. And I don't...
Negative or positive feelings?
I think they're complicated. Right. I think most of it's pretty negative because he made us look bad. Like, you know, we start that chapter with like 40,000 people showed up on the street to celebrate his 6th victory. Like the city loved him. We named all the stuff after him that they then had to take his name off of. So I do think there's still a lot of feeling about him, but I think it's more complicated now than it used to be. But sometimes fans don't care. Like, one of the things that I learned, and other people probably knew this, but it was something I had to learn, was the huge Balco scandal with steroids out of the Bay Area. I assumed that was just a baseball scandal based on how the media covered it. And then when I was researching, I was like, oh, there were a bunch of football players, NFL players involved here. But because we have all these ideas, these cultural ideas about the purity of baseball, I think, again, I will say, I think race plays a role in who we care about when they're doping. And baseball has a white sheen on it in the way that the NFL does not. And the brutality of football, I think we've all just come to accept, like, whatever happens there. But I was surprised. I was like, wow, we really told a specific story here about one sport and a totally separate one, or we didn't even tell the other story about football. So that made me really think, like, fans do care sometimes and they don't care other times. And that itself is what's really interesting about it.
Lance, is so fascinating from your particular vantage point, because I didn't realize you were from Austin. Like, this is something that I often put down to as, you know, it's cycling. So maybe not everybody in the United States cares that much about cycling. Let's be blunt about it. That this is a sport that Americans could afford to shed from their public consciousness if they wanted. Not in the way that, you know, a Cowboys fan could just shed the Cowboys from their sporting consciousness. Is that the case? Would that make it easier for you, for everybody in Texas?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we used to be like, we're a super bike friendly city. And like, even that was part of, which isn't true, but that was like a thing we told ourselves. And there's all these bike things. I think we still have a bike path named after him somewhere. Right. I heard it recently and I was like, whoa, his name is on something in the city. So there was a way that the city itself attached to him. But I think, I don't know. That's such a good point, that like cycling isn't important to the psyche of Americans in the way that other sports are, so that we could just sort of push it aside. But the city itself was so deeply invested in him. We all learned enough about the Tour de France to like understand what a yellow jersey was and how he earned it. And those weren't things that we knew before. So, but I will say, like, the thing that complicated Lance Armstrong for me, I mean, he was a real jerk about responding to the allegations of doping. I think there's no argument that the aggressive way in which he responded to people who said he was doping was really terrible. But then you find out that basically everyone he was competing against was also doping. And I think that's complicated because he's like, you wanted me to win and everyone else was doing it. Like, what am I supposed to do? And then I'll just mention there's this great documentary on Netflix called Icarus, if people haven't seen it, about doping and the way that they start the whole thing. It's mainly about Russian systemic doping in the Olympics, but the way the whole thing starts is the guy decides he's going to dope and then do a cycling event and to see how much it helps him. And he's terrible. Like, he doesn't do well. And so you learn that, like, it's not enough to just take steroids and like go hit a baseball. Like, those two things don't actually correlate like on their own. You have to still have these skills. So it became much more complicated for me about how I felt about his choices and like our demands, like as fans, like here in Austin, like we created this whole structure around this man and we wanted to see him win. But we also wanted to believe the lie that he could just do it. So I don't know. I don't have a good answer for you, I guess.
Well, that is a really good answer. And like you mentioned the Olympic Games there, which can sometimes seem like the byproduct of just so much jingoism that occurs, particularly in the media. And like, I guess from a United States perspective, you'd have had a lot of winners who ultimately are going to get torn down at certain points, legitimately so. And I'm interested when it comes to jingoism, the idea of someone like Marion Jones, for example, and how she would have been so celebrated, Kavitha, and for that moment to then be torn down. Is that a tough thing as an American sports fan?
It's definitely a tough thing for us. The jingoism aspect of the Olympics, Jessica and I love the Olympics. Like, the Olympics are a showcase for obviously like nationalism and bordering on jingoism, but also for women's sports in a way that we don't have regularly. So we wrote that chapter very much with an eye toward the fact that we were criticizing this thing that we think is actually kind of important to some of the things that we think are important. Sure. But when Marion Jones gets taken down, it does cut at it cuts at your psyche as an American. It cuts at everything that you think of rooting for. And I think one of the through lines in this book is why we are so connected to these sports or to these athletes. And, especially like if you talk about Lance Armstrong and, American cycling people, we were, because Lance was one of ours and he was dominating. That made us feel good about ourselves and feel good about our country and that kind of thing. And if you think about when your individual sports fandoms are formed, that's one of the reasons that these issues are so difficult for us to deal with. We talked to a sports psychologist, Dr. Susan K. Whitbourne, who basically explained not anything new, but she put it in a way that I thought was revelatory, that if you think about when your sports fandoms are formed, it's early in life. It's super early in life, and it's when your identities are being formed. It's your childhood. It has to do with your hometowns, and in the case of the Olympics or cycling, your country. It has to do with your family. Dad took me to my first ball game, that kind of thing. And it's really difficult when those institutions are being challenged, or when those athletes are being challenged. It feels like you're being challenged in yourself. So, if you're a kid growing up, and you want to be a track star and you loved Marion Jones and you saw that happening, and especially if you're a Black woman in America who wanted to win a gold medal and you saw Marion Jones get taken down, it feels like that's something that's happening towards you personally, even though it's not. And that's one of the hardest things for us to deal with as sports fans.
I guess it comes back to the idea of talking about Olympians as we want to win X amount of medals, and we have had X amount of medals stripped. I guess it all feeds into the consciousness. It works both ways. Just to finish up on chapter 6 then, watching women's basketball when people tell you you're the only one. I'm not sure what your vantage point is on this, but certainly when it comes to the coverage of certain women in sport, it's definitely changed, I feel, since last summer with the World Cup. I definitely feel that Ireland's national women's team has suddenly got 5-10 times more coverage than it would have got 12 months previously, because we were all watching the Women's World Cup last year. I guess you're coming from a vantage point where that World Cup has always been a big deal in the United States because of the success of your national team. But I'm just wondering, have you seen green shoots on that front, on the topics covered in that chapter over the last little while?
Yes.
Right.
That's great to hear about Ireland, because I don't know a ton about the Irish women's national team. But I was fortunate and I got to go last summer to the World Cup. I went to the first 2 weeks in France. And the thing I always think about is I was there for the, what is it, the round robin? What is the first 2 weeks?
The group stage, yeah.
the group stage, God, my friends are going to be so annoyed at me for never memorizing that. And I went, the final game that I watched was Argentina versus Scotland on a Wednesday night. It wasn't a super important game just in general. And the stadium wasn't in the center of Paris, right? It's kind of on the outskirts. You had to get there. And there were so many people there. And it actually turned out to be a deeply thrilling game because Argentina came back to tie it when they were 3 down, which I know was heartbreaking for Scotland. But it was the most thrilling game I actually had seen the whole time. But I just was so amazed at how many people had shown up for this game that didn't really matter in the larger scheme. It wasn't one of the top games. Like, I got to see France play a couple times and the stadium was packed. And I don't know, it felt different then. Last year felt different to me even than 4 years previous. And then I feel like over the last year in particular, I don't know if this is that the news media is getting better at it. I think part of it is that a lot of women around the world are advocating very loudly for pay equity. So these are big stories all over the place right now. But also, I just think people are getting better access. Like this summer, we saw the NWSL here in the US, the WNBA. As lots of leagues are suffering with ratings, they did really great. And I think a lot of that was just because they got on television in a way that they hadn't before, which is a good proving point that like you aren't the only one watching. There are lots of people watching, like CBS, the NWSL. They did so well that they got UEFA, the Champs League here, like, and they weren't going to show it until like the last minute because there was such a push. And so, yeah, I feel green shoots is like that's a great way to think about it. I do feel it right now. I'm more optimistic now than I've been in a long time.
Yeah. And sorry, go ahead, Kavitha.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was just actually going to make the point that I'll hold my hands up and say my main way of following the WNBA is by following Shea Serrano on Twitter. Like, I think he's fantastic. I've read his books, and I didn't realize the backstory to why he's made such a big effort until reading the chapter in your book. And that is really the key, isn't it? I mean, like, you've got quotes from Bill Plaschke in there as well about his own guilt of, like, why didn't I cover women's sports in the way I covered men's sports before? Like, if you follow the ratings, you miss the point, is his quote, which is a brilliant, brilliant line, Kavitha.
Well, thank you. I do think that the money part, I mean, I've been doing this work for quite a few years. I'm a sports business reporter by trade. So I very much look at where the money is going. And I think that when broadcasters finally realized that there was money to be made in putting these games on TV, right? I mean, for years, you couldn't find the WNBA. You didn't know what channel it was on, if it was on TV at all. It was probably on during a Tuesday in the afternoon when people were still at work. And now they're making smarter decisions about when they're putting these games on, and people are watching. As Jessica said, when you put women's sports on TV, people watch women's sports. It's this mind-blowing thing. I think that there's an interesting dynamic when it comes to soccer, especially in this country, because our men's soccer is just not very good, like, obviously, not compared to the rest of the world. And so we have it ingrained in ourselves to root for the women, but only every 4 years. And the question for decades has been, how do we translate that to an everyday, every month, every year thing, and not just for the World Cup? And I think we're starting to figure that out. It takes a lot of infrastructure investment, and we're starting to see that globally. It's really exciting to see these gigantic soccer clubs around in the UK and the Prem and everywhere start to sign these women to these huge contracts. And it's probably the first time that you'll see an American signed to a soccer contract and not think, what was that club doing? Apologies to Serginho Dest. But I will also add, I have quite a tight-knit group of friends who are from Ireland here in New York. And I am always incredibly amazed when I go up to Gaelic Park in the Bronx, how much support there is for the women's GAA teams. And that seems to translate very well from the homeland. And so I'm extremely optimistic to think that that would translate to American sports fandom and to women's sports fandom globally.
Yeah, there's a lot in there as well, and your point about every 4 years is a really good one, because in the GAA at the moment we're getting these amazing figures for the All-Ireland final in women's football, record-breaking figures, but then for the rest of the year, for the semi-finals and before that, the numbers are down a little bit. So it's about turning the event junkies into the year-round, or the every single year as it would be in soccer. It's a really good point. There's so much in this book. If you're listening to this piece, you're listening to Jessica Luther and Kavitha Davidson. The book is called Loving Sports When They Don't Love You Back. You can check it out now on Amazon, I presume, folks, is the best place to get it.
In Ireland, probably. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. It'll be a good Christmas gift. Folks, thanks so much for taking the time out of your day. Really appreciate it.